In the quiet, sleepy town of Chambers Flat, a 40-minute drive from Brisbane in Australia, lived the seemingly ordinary Thorburn family. Father Rick earned his living as a hard-working truck driver until back problems forced him to switch to a car and open a small business selling fast food from a van. Julia, the mother of the family, ran a home-based kindergarten, taking in kids from the neighborhood. Besides them, the couple's two sons, 19-year-old John and 18-year-old Trent, lived in the house. From the outside, nothing seemed to indicate any particular dysfunction or abnormality in this ordinary Australian family. However, everything changed in early 2015 when the Thorburns received a 12-year-old girl, Tia Palmer, as a foster child. From the very beginning, the girl was not lucky. She came from a dysfunctional family where quarrels and violence prevailed. That's why Tia's biological mother was forced to place her under state care. The girl was transferred from one foster family to another because of her difficult and disobedient nature, her tendency to run away and commit offenses. However, the Thorburn family seemed to be quite decent and wealthy, so social services chose them. How terribly mistaken the employees of these institutions were later. The respectable facade of the family hid cruelty, perversion, and a mortal threat to a defenseless child. From the very first days of her stay in the new home, Tia began to feel disturbing signals and even told her classmates about it. The girl begged her friends to let her stay with them, as the Thorburns were mistreating her. However, none of the teenagers took these complaints seriously, because Tia was a rather troubled child herself and had a reputation for being naughty and stubborn. Besides, the Thorburns were considered to be a model family of good behavior, so why would anyone question their good name because of the talk of a teenage girl? On October 30th, 2015, Tia Palmer's life ended in the most horrific way. That day, as usual, in the morning, her foster father, Rick Thorburn, drove her to school. At least that's the version he told others. In fact, as the police later found out, there was no trip to the school. Tia had strangely disappeared right from home. Around noon, an alarming call came from Morrison State High School, where the Thorburns' adopted daughter was studying. It turned out that Tia Palmer had not shown up for class at all. Assuming that she had simply run away from home again, such episodes had already occurred in her adult biography, the concerned foster parents turned to the police. Tia was put on the wanted list, but the search yielded no results. She disappeared, as if she had fallen underground. The Thorburns calmly waited for the approach of the dreaded Halloween, which was Tia's favorite time of year. The girl had even prepared a festive costume, but was never able to try it on. Less than a week later, a terrible tragedy occurred that no one could have even imagined. On the morning of November 5th, 2015, the coastal reeds of the Pambama River, 30 kilometers from Chambers Flat, hit a dumping ground of human remains in a state of severe decomposition. A local fisherman discovered this gruesome discovery and immediately reported it to the police. Forensic experts were unable to immediately identify the exact gender and age of the deceased. The body was so mutilated. The only thing that the forensic experts realized was that the victim had suffered a violent death. The remains of the poor man were sent for examination, and the police tried to compare the DNA with the records of missing persons in the Brisbane area. The terrible guess was soon confirmed. The found remains belonged to 12-year-old Tia Palmer. Experts also determined that, in addition to the animal attack marks present on the body, there were also traces of brutal human violence. Murder is the only way to describe it. But who and for what motives decided to do this? The Thorburns were the first to come under suspicion, as the last people to have seen Tia alive. However, at first their testimony seemed unwavering and even quite convincing. In particular, Rick firmly stated that he had driven the girl to school on the morning of her disappearance. He said she was cheerful, smiling, and nothing foreshadowed such a terrible outcome. The investigation even partially confirmed their words. Surveillance footage captured Rick Thorburn's car at that unfortunate hour in the morning near the school. However, Tia herself was not seen in the footage. It is quite possible that the girl simply got out and walked away on her own, leaving her father in the car. After all, she has had similar stories before. Tia could get separated from her guardians and disappear for several days until she was found. Despite the Thorburns' initially convincing explanation, the police still could not shake a number of uncomfortable questions and doubts. After all, The official version that Tia had simply run away again and gotten into trouble contrasted too sharply with the brutal injuries on the victim's body. Could a girl at such a young age have been the object of such inhuman aggression? Suspicions were further heightened when one of the victim's classmates suddenly revealed shocking details. It turns out that Tia confessed to her friends that she was in an intimate relationship with the Thorburn's 19-year-old stepson, Trent. According to the girl, she sincerely fell in love with the older boy, although he abused her feelings. At the same time, Tia was terrified of the entire Thorburn family, especially Trent himself and his father Rick. This information forced investigators to take a fresh look at the victim's environment. After all, the initial analysis of the crime scene and circumstances gave reason to suspect a sexual motive for the murder. It is likely that the girl could have been raped and then strangled or beaten to death to hide the crime. So the police decided to target the Thorburn family themselves. During the first interrogation, they did not just deny the accusations. The foster parents and their sons behaved defiantly and aggressively, as if they had something to hide. Experienced investigators sensed the falsity and realized that not everything was clean. The turning point in the investigation was an anonymous tip that came to the police hotline in early May 2016. An unknown informant reported that he had valuable information about the involvement of members of the Thorburn family in the death of Tia Palmer. According to the informant, the family was initially focused on finding a problematic foster child and receiving increased state aid for him or her. They had no real affection for Tia herself, only an undisguised mercantile interest. Moreover, the anonymous person insisted that the entire Thorburn household, from the head of the family to his sons and wife, was allegedly involved in the crime and its cover-up. Although no specific details or circumstances were given, investigators decided not to ignore the call. There were too many suspicious coincidences and gaps around Tia's mysterious death in the Thorburn home. The police immediately set up a wiretap in the family's home, hoping to capture valuable evidence of their involvement in the crime. And soon, the audio surveillance began to yield impressive results. It turned out that 19-year-old Trent had been cynically raping the minor Tia for more than 10 months, taking advantage of her childish naivety and helplessness. And his parents, Rick and Julia, if not incited to it, then at least tacitly condoned their son's perversion. Of course, the Thorburns initially denied any accusations against them. However, later, when the amount of evidence collected by the police convincingly proved their guilt, they had to admit the brutal truth. It turned out that just a few days before Tia's death, a family meeting was held at the Thorburns' home, during which it became known that the girl had an intimate relationship with Trent. There was a real threat that everything would be made public, and Tia could become pregnant by a perverted teenager. To solve this problem, Rick Thorburn decided to act radically. After kicking all the family out of the house, the furious father locked himself in with Tia. When the family returned later, there was no sign of the girl. When asked about her whereabouts, Rick only snapped, "It's all settled. She won't tell anyone else." The terrible hunch that the father had simply killed Tia was confirmed during the wiretap. With his own mouth, the monster Trent admitted that Rick literally strangled the defenseless girl with his bare hands and then took her mutilated body and threw it into the coastal reeds of the Pambama River, all in order to hide the shame and ugly perversion of his eldest son. The horrific discovery not only explained the cause of the unfortunate child's death, but also pointed to all those involved in the crime. So the police immediately arrested members of the Thorburn clan on suspicion of premeditated murder, sexual abuse of a minor, as well as concealing a crime and obstructing an investigation by lying and falsifying information. The following events developed with lightning speed. Under the burden of irrefutable evidence gathered by the police, the defendants began to plead guilty one by one and confess to the most heinous acts. The first to break down were the women of this criminal clan, Julia Thorburn and her daughter-in-law. Both fully confirmed the horrific information that investigators had obtained from the audio recordings. Later, their younger son Trent followed suit. After 3 members of the Thorburn family pleaded guilty, the last one, Rick, bore the brunt of the evidence. He was required to make a full confession to the murder of his adopted daughter Tia and to disclose all the circumstances of this horrific crime. Initially, the enraged father met with brutal resistance, denying any accusations. However, later, when it became clear that it was useless to deny, he capitulated. Under the pressure of overwhelming evidence, Rick Thorburn pleaded guilty to the murder of 12-year-old Tia Palmer for heinous motives. His words painted a terrifying picture of the events that took place in his home. Upon learning of his youngest son Trent's immoral relationship with a girl in his care, Rick called the entire family together for a family meeting. The horrifying truth came out. Trent had been systematically raping and molesting naive Tia for 10 months, taking advantage of her gullibility and helplessness. In the midst of the scandal, it turned out that the teenager could even get his underage partner pregnant. This finally ruined the reputation of the perfect family in the eyes of Rick Thorburn. As the head of this clan of freaks, he decided to hide the disgusting truth at all costs and solve the problem radically and permanently. The evening after that scandalous family meeting, Rick Thorburn kicked everyone out of the house, leaving him alone with a defenseless Tia. What happened behind closed doors is anyone's guess. One thing is certain: when the family returned later, there was no trace of the girl. When asked about her fate, the callous Rick only snapped, "She's done. She's not going to tell me anything else." As the perpetrator later confessed, he strangled the girl with his bare hands in her own bed, and then brutally defiled and dismembered her body, all in order to make it as difficult as possible to identify the victim during a possible investigation. The day after the crime, Rick Thorburn took Tia's remains to the coastal reeds of the Pambama River and dumped them there, where they were later discovered by a fisherman. By confusing the true traces of the tragedy with the fiction of Tia's alleged escape or disappearance from home, the bandit Thorburn hoped to divert any suspicion from himself and his family. At first, he almost succeeded. The police really started looking for the girl as a missing person, questioning relatives and friends. But later, during audio surveillance, the details of the heinous crime came to light. The family members, frightened by the patriarch's cruelty, were forced to admit their involvement in the murder cover-up and perjury. Rick's convoluted story fell apart under the pressure of hard evidence. Of course, the public reaction to such a heinous crime was sharp and unequivocal. People demanded a fair punishment for the monsters who committed such an atrocity. Despite the efforts of the Thorburns' lawyers, the court left them virtually no chance of acquittal. As a result of the trial, the judges' decisions were quite harsh. The two women of the family received the lightest sentences. Julia Thorburn was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison for giving false testimony and concealing a crime. Her younger daughter-in-law received the same sentence for similar offenses. Their husbands and sons, the main perpetrators of the tragedy, were dealt with more severely. 19-year-old Trent, who confessed to sexually abusing the minor Tia, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. This young man, by the way, was released in 2018 after serving only 16 months in prison. The most cruel punishment was expected to befall the main executioner of this story, Rick Thorburn. The court found him guilty of premeditated murder with extreme cruelty and concealing the traces of the crime. Based on the totality of his crimes, this monster was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 20 years of serving his sentence. But was this a proper punishment for the murder of a defenseless child? Wasn't the punishment too lenient for a beast capable of such a thing? This question will torment public opinion and lawyers for a long time to come. The wave of public outrage caused by this horrific story forced the Australian authorities to analyze the current child welfare system and make a number of changes to it. The vetting of candidates for foster parents was strengthened, especially those who had previously had conflicts with the law. New, more stringent requirements were added to the procedure and timing of placing troubled adolescents in foster care. From now on, it will be necessary to study the psychological state of such minors more carefully in order to avoid such dramatic cases. In addition, it has become clear that the selection of guardians alone is not enough. It is also important to organize systematic psychological support for both children and their foster parents. The latter now have to undergo special trainings that will help them better understand the character. When considering the case of Tia Palmer, it is impossible to ignore another extremely important aspect: the attitude of society to such high-profile cases. On the one hand, the tragedy of the 12-year-old girl really shocked the public and caused a wave of outrage. People gathered for pickets, demanding that the crime be solved and the perpetrators be properly punished. More than 600 people came to Tia's funeral to express their support and condolences, although most of them had never known the victim personally. This reaction is understandable. The brutal murder of a defenseless child cannot leave normal people indifferent. At the same time, various comments and statements often included an unjustified desire for revenge and overly emotional calls for violence against the perpetrators themselves. Of course, the indignation was quite justified, but we should not forget about humanitarian values and the rule of law even in such cases. On the other hand, many ordinary citizens still stay away from high-profile criminal stories, focusing only on their own problems. If a tragedy does not directly affect their family, they quickly lose interest in it. That is why it is extremely important to maintain public interest and not allow such cases to fade into the background. However, the most disturbing thing is the indifference and apathy of many people who were directly involved in the case but did not show proper reaction and attention. Let's recall that one of Tia's school friends warned about a possible threat to the girl from the foster family, but instead of taking decisive action, this evidence was simply ignored. The behavior of the Thorburn's neighbors is also surprising and condemnable. According to the testimonies, they never noticed any signs of dysfunction or abuse in the family. It seemed that idle and comfort reigned there. Were these people deliberately turning a blind eye to the obvious signals to avoid interfering in other people's business? Tia's story painfully illustrates how terrible the consequences of human indifference and ignoring problems can be. If someone had shown more concern and responsibility, the tragedy might have been prevented. We all have to be vigilant and respond to any manifestations of cruelty, especially against the defenseless. After all, the lives of others are not someone else's business, but a shared concern.